In order to effectively manage change in any organization, it's important to understand some key terms and concepts of organizational change management. And so what I want to talk about today are the top 10 terms that you need to be aware of as a change management practitioner. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. And much of the work we do for our clients is focused on organizational change, helping organizations transition from where they are today to where they want to be in the future. And obviously, this extends well beyond technology to the people equation. And within the people side of the equation is organizational change management. That's what enables these sorts of changes. Now, I've included a number of videos on my YouTube channel about what is change management, what are some of the top strategies you should be deploying, and so I encourage you to check out those videos if you haven't already seen them. But today what I want to focus on is what are those top 10 terms and definitions that you need to be aware of in order to effectively manage change within your organization. And this is critical not only if you're a change management practitioner on a change management team, but also if you're a leader or a project team member that's just involved in any sort of change initiative. These terms and definitions are things you need to know as well. One of the first things that's very important to understand as a change management practitioner is the concept of resistance to change. And on the surface, it sounds simple enough. It means it's when humans resist change. But it's actually a lot more complicated than that, because oftentimes, more often than not, you can't see or tell when people are going to resist change. And it's also more often than not that people are not blatantly trying to sabotage a project. They're typically not trying to derail a project, but because we're all human, we all have human weaknesses. There's human weaknesses that come into play that cause us to resist change in some way, in some fundamental aspect of our transformation. So that's what resistance to change is, and there's two types of resistance. There's intentional resistance, which is I feel threatened, therefore I want to intentionally derail the project. That's not the most common form of resistance to change, but the more common form of resistance is unintentional resistance. So this is really striking at the heart of who we are as people. It's underlying root causes that are triggered by fear, anxiety, uncertainty, lack of information, internal politics. All those sorts of things can manifest themselves in resistance to change. So regardless of what the source of resistance is, it's important to understand that people will resist change, and managing that resistance to change is a key component of effective organizational change management. One of the early initiatives that should happen in any sort of change initiative is to focus on stakeholder analysis. And a stakeholder analysis is really looking at your key executives and key influencers within an organization to understand what makes them tick. What is their role in the organization? Who do they influence? What is their view of the project? Are they aligned as a team? All that understanding of these different stakeholders is very important, because ultimately you want to make sure that you get alignment, which I'm going to come back to that point here later in this video. But you want to make sure people are aligned, that you have that internal alignment at the executive and stakeholder level. And you also want to make sure that you understand what makes them tick so that you can target those stakeholders to make sure that they're informed, to make sure they're part of the process, and ultimately to make sure that they buy into and support the overall transformation. So that sort of stakeholder analysis is a critical term and definition to understand in any sort of change initiative. Just a moment ago, I talked about alignment and how you want to make sure your stakeholders are aligned. And that's part of a stakeholder analysis, but I actually call out executive alignment as its own standalone term and definition because that is very important. And the key to executive alignment, which is a bit different than stakeholder analysis, is to ensure that you have an executive team that's aligned and has a common shared set of goals and objectives for the transformation initiative. Sounds simple enough, but a lot of executive teams for a lot of organizations throughout the world are not aligned on what they want to be when they grow up. And if they don't know what they want to be when they grow up, or if they have misaligned expectations on what they want to be when they grow up, it's almost impossible to lead effectively a change initiative. So our job as change practitioners is to ensure that we support and enable that executive alignment as much as possible. Now, we're not just talking about executive alignment here, we're also just talking about internal alignment in general. Certainly it starts at the executive level, but you also want to make sure that mid-level management all the way down to the frontline employees are aligned in terms of what this project means, how they're supporting the project, how this overall transformation will support the organization going forward. All that stuff, you need to make sure that you have that level of alignment so that you're not facing headwinds and you translate those potential headwinds into tailwinds to help further enable a successful change initiative. Any organization going through any sort of digital or business transformation is migrating from point A to point B. In other words, there's the current state, where they are today, and where they want to be in the future. Now, for some people, they think that it's as simple as just deploying new technologies. But the reality is, yes, technology is going to change, but the real change, the more fundamental change, is at the employee level. Individual humans are being impacted by that technology. Their jobs are changing. Certain parts of their job might go away. Certain parts of their job might get reassigned to others within the organization. But there's a whole organizational design concept that leads to change impacts. And so as change practitioners, we really need to understand what are the change impacts to the organization. How exactly will this transformation change each person's job, each department's job, each business unit, or each location? How will those different areas be affected differently? And so it's a really focused, almost surgical way of analyzing how different parts of the organization are affected, and ultimately that should lead to a change management strategy and plan that addresses those specific change impacts. Now, next on our list is training and enablement, oftentimes referred to as employee or user enablement. And essentially what this is training employees on how to use the new technologies. Now, for a lot of people, they think that this is a technical exercise. We're just going to show people how the technology works. That certainly is part of training and enablement, but the more important part of training and enablement is showing people how they're going to use technology to do their day-to-day jobs, and also to show what their end-to-end job looks like, both in areas where they're using the new technology and maybe even in some areas where they're not touching technology. It might be a decision process, or they might be turning to other technologies that weren't involved in the transformation that are going to become key parts of their job. So the key here is not just to train people on new technologies, but more importantly, to train people on their business processes, what their new roles and responsibilities are going to be. And as you can imagine, that's a pretty extensive proposition. Now, one thing I'll note is that training and enablement should not wait until the very end to happen. You should be starting those activities earlier than your pre-go live training that happens right before go live. You want to be training people on their new processes, their new roles and responsibilities along the way, so that they work through those and understand those high-level changes, so that by the time you get to the end-user training right before go live, it's more focused on the technology and more the transactions of how they're going to do what they've already been told in terms of how their jobs are going to change. So this is a key part of change management that every organization should be well aware of. Next on our list is communications plan, and it sounds pretty self-explanatory, but there's a lot to a communications plan. Essentially what it is defining all the different stakeholders, all the different departments, maybe even some influential individuals within your organization, and defining who those target audiences are for different communications messages that need to happen throughout a transformation. And communications plans typically start from day one of a transformation and continue all the way through and even after the go live of new technologies or new business processes or whatever the transformation entails. And so the communication plan really outlines in detail who the audience is, how we're going to reach that audience, the frequency, when we're going to reach the audience, what vehicle or mechanism we're going to use to reach that audience. So are we going to send emails? Are we going to do in-person meetings, one-on-one meetings, group meetings, departmental meetings, whatever the case may be, or it could be digital delivery of messaging as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can deploy messaging to organizations, and the key here is that you want to identify who those people are, what the messages are, and you want to make sure you have a variety of ways of reaching different people. Now, one thing to note about communications planning is you want to think of it as much like a marketing plan or a marketing strategy. You have to repeat the same messages repeatedly over and over in order for people to fully understand the message. So while you, as part of a project team or part of a transformation, may fully understand and be well aware of what the impacts of the transformation are, most people in your organization don't understand it nearly as well as you do. So you really have to drive those points home and really err on the side of repetition and frequency to ensure that you're reaching your intended audience and to ensure that you're reaching them via different vehicles, whether it's email combined with in-person meetings, combined with flyers posted on the wall, whatever the case may be. You want to make sure you have a clear and deliberate plan for how you're going to communicate key messages to employees as they're affected by the transformation. Next up is organizational design. And this is one of the more overlooked concepts within organizational change management. And the reason for that is a lot of times people focus on some of the other stuff I've already talked about, the communications plan, the training and enablement. Those are two examples of areas that are just intuitive to most people. They understand because it's very tangible. It's something you can see and touch and feel. And so that becomes the focus and the priority for a lot of organizational change strategies. But something like organizational design is just as important, maybe even more important than all the other things I've talked about so far, which is why it's so high on our countdown list here. And essentially what organizational design is defining how people's jobs are going to look after the transformation. So for example, if you're automating 50% of Susie's job because now you're deploying an artificial intelligence-based application that's going to automate 50% of her job that's going to go away, now we need to define, well, what does her job look like? What is that other 50% going to be consumed with? A lot of times executives and project team members will gloss over that really important point, which will contribute to the resistance to change later on, which I talked about earlier. So in order for Susie not to resist change, she needs to have a clear vision of what her job is going to look like. And we as managers and leaders need to understand what that job is going to look like so that we can deploy those changes and change expectations, change job roles and responsibilities, change job descriptions, change compensation plans if needed. There's a whole host of activities that go into redesigning an organization, but you need to be deliberate about it and make sure you clearly articulate and define what that organizational design is going to look like in the post-transformation world that you're headed toward. Another underrated and often overlooked aspect of change management is benefits realization. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, and we take what are generally soft, touchy-feely, and intangible aspects of change management, and we translate it into measurable business value. So what is it that we're doing as an organization in terms of organizational changes, process improvements, change impacts, all the stuff we've talked about so far? How do those activities drive real business value? And we want to connect the dots so that we're focused on activities that are going to increase business value. So for example, if our business case for our transformation is that we want to reduce costs by increasing efficiency, then our change management activities should really focus on those tangible aspects of the change. Let's focus on those areas that are going to drive efficiency and increase productivity and increase overall profitability. And not only does this help with the transformation overall, because it focuses on those right metrics and translating some of the change activities into measurable measures, but it also builds a business case of justification for the change management efforts. A lot of organizations fail to recognize the need for change management, but when it's tied to those measurable areas of business value, it becomes easier to justify those change activities. So be sure you include benefits realization as part of any sort of organizational change strategy that you might be involved with. Number 2 on our list is organizational readiness. And organizational readiness is exactly what it implies. It's how ready is the organization for change. So we've defined new processes, we've defined what a new technological roadmap is going to look like, we've put together our communications plan, our change strategy, all the stuff we've talked about so far in this video. But at some point, there are milestones along the way where you have to measure how ready is the organization? What is the temperature of the organization? Where are the pockets of resistance? How are people managing the change? How are they coming along with the change? Are the people ready for the change? So in other words, if we're 30 days before go live and people are expressing extreme doubt or concern about their ability to do their jobs, that's a red flag that you want to make sure you mitigate before you go live. But organizational readiness isn't just something you do right before go live. It's actually something you should start from the very beginning and continue to measure, because it's something that will continue to evolve throughout the transformation. So organizational readiness assessments are a key quantitative and qualitative tool that we use to ensure that we are measuring the health and the temperature of an organization and the overall readiness of the organization for change, so that we can pivot the overall change strategies and the overall program strategies to address whatever risks or concerns are arising during those assessments. So be sure that you have this whole concept of organizational readiness as part of your overall change strategy. Now, number 1 on our list is a culmination of everything we've talked about in this video so far, and that is your organizational change plan. This is arguably the most important part of change management, which is why it's number 1 on our list. So the organizational change plan is really the way that we tie together all these other 9 areas we've talked about, as well as other areas that aren't in our top 10 list, and it puts them into a more definitive, predictable project plan. So each of these work streams we've talked about so far will have their own subtasks and resources and dependencies, deliverables, And ultimately, this change plan needs to be integrated into the overall program plan. So it's something that you want to make sure is aligned, and you want to make sure you reconcile whatever timeline the overall program is on with the change management plan. Now, one caveat or one word of caution as it relates to creating a change plan is we oftentimes see that the change plan is inconsistent with the overall program plan. So in other words, the overall program plan might have a very aggressive time frame, and the change plan might suggest that the time frame needs to be longer. And oftentimes, it's the change management side of things that will cause delays in a project. So ultimately, you have to reconcile those two things and decide how aggressive do we really want to be with our timeline, and how much do we really want to invest in change management. I would argue that it's typically cheaper and a higher business value to go ahead and invest in change management, but it's up to you as an organization to define that. But regardless of what answer you come to related to that question, you want to make sure you have a clear change management plan that supports the overall program management plan. So I hope this has given you some good definition of 10 key concepts that are important to understand as it relates to organizational change management. For more information, I've also included a link to our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a guide that we published not too long ago that includes a number of best practices and tips and methodologies and frameworks for managing change and managing an organizational change initiative within any sort of transformation. So I encourage you to download that with a link I've included in the description below. So I hope you found this information useful, and hope you have a great day.